So Games Workshop have hit 40k's new Space Dwarves with the Nerf hammer, and they've applied it rather brutally as well. Massive points increases and a reduction to the Judgement Tokens. Let's talk about the changes. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's new rules update for the Leagues of Votann, where it seems that they've felt that the rules that they wrote for them are just so much of a problem that they're going to hit them very, very hard, and also maybe surprisingly early. I think the vast majority of people have heard at least concerning things about the Votann being very strong and potentially problematic for 40k's game balance from people who have been using the Codex rules since they leaked. It even got to the extent where there were some rumblings about tournaments thinking about banning them, and a lot of people just having negative reactions to the army as a whole just because they were seeing it as Games Workshop making overpowered rules to sell models. Games Workshop have issued a rules update for the Leagues of Votann today, a bit of an about face by them, and basically saying that they've listened to feedback and the army's rules are a bit on the strong side, and they've applied 2 nerfs, one to points cost and one to the Judgement Tokens, to try and make sure that the army isn't just annihilating other factions left, right and centre. I think a fair few people will probably criticise because it happens straight after they've actually sold all the launch boxes. For people who've decided to go big on the new codex and have maybe been planning armies already, this will change things a lot for them. Though to be honest, with 40k's history, I think not many people are surprised that strong armies get toned down, though admittedly not usually quite as early or brutally as this. I would say that in general, if they were going to nerf the Leagues of Votann, it is probably better that they do it as early as possible, so that people know the models that they're buying as early as possible, and seeing as they were looking incredibly strong indeed, not just having several months worth of 40k games where if you had Space Dwarves you were at a massive advantage. Admittedly, while they will have just sold a whole bunch of launch boxes for the Leagues of Votann, maybe at least some of them encouraged by strong rules for the faction, they have done this before the main kits go up for general sale. For example, that crazy combo with the Land Fortress, they have sold 0 of those so far. So to be honest, in general, I think it is probably better that they make changes before most of the kits go up for sale, rather than after. The nerfs come in 2 parts, one change to Judgement Tokens that quite a lot of people seem to be calling for, and then also a points nerf, literally every single unit in the book being increased in points, though some by a lot more than others. First up, let's talk about those Judgement Tokens, certainly a really powerful army-wide mechanic, allowing you to stack Judgement Tokens on some units that have offended you, and get auto-wound attacks on 6s, 5s or 4s. It is a very powerful mechanic, but perhaps one that is a bit better against certain really big units than others. For example, tough armies like maybe Imperial Knights or Adeptus Custodes, they will really suffer with this, whereas armies with a bunch of expendable or fragile units, maybe like Genestealer cults, probably won't care too much. The way it's printed in the codex, when you get an auto wound with a Judgement Token, that auto wound counts as an unmodified wound roll of a 6. I think this one struck people as a pretty problematic mechanic as soon as they read it. A fair few other weapons in the codex get some additional abilities when they wound on a 6, so it meant that those abilities would be very, very easy to access, particularly with a 1 command point stratagem to reroll all hits. Perhaps the 2 silliest combos out of any of them were triggering the Land Fortress's splash damage on the Magna Rail Cannon. That could give you a massive chance of just deleting squads outright with no questions asked. And also, I think it was a bit silly on the Brokir Iron Master's deluge of mortal wounds that he could put out with that Grav gun. He's the one who could theoretically kill Rabute Gilliman twice over within 1 turn if you just fed him a few CP. I feel like this is a pretty reasonable targeted nerf to rein in the worst excesses of damage output of the codex, while still keeping the Judgement Token mechanic intact. I do think it is quite a fun and interesting one. I think it is still going to feel like a very, very painful and strong rule for certain units to get 3 of them, but at least this targeted approach breaks a few of the silliest combos around, things that really felt overtuned and just kill things with no questions asked with mortal wounds or ignoring invuls. Really though, while that one does kill some out there combos, the main nerf to the codex is just points. I think this isn't really the worst way to tone them down, to be honest. Quite a lot of the mechanics do feel quite appropriate and quite interesting flavour wise. It's just the fact that they were applied to units that already had really quite efficient damage dealing profiles, and that could potentially be a bit too much. They really haven't pulled their punches with this points update though. Literally every single unit in the book went up a bit, including units that I don't think were quite as standout, maybe the standard Halfkin Warriors and the Brokir Thunderkin, but you certainly can't argue that these changes are going to make the army much less strong. All the points changes are targeted at the unit's base points values, they aren't changing any war gear bits whatsoever, and for once Games Workshop even went out of their way to highlight the points changes, which makes it a bit easier for us understanding what has changed from one thing to the next. If we actually go through the points changes, the HQs all went up somewhere between 10 to 20%. Uthar the Destined is 160 points from 140, the Ironhair Champions up to 110 points base from 90, the Carl's up 10 points to 80, and both the Grimnir and the Brockir Iron Master are both up to 90 points from 80. None of the Votann Council upgrades are changed, so they are all exactly the same. Out of these, the heaviest percentage nerf has fallen on the Ironhair Champion. Admittedly, he does have pretty excellent combat stats for the cost, particularly with that Relic Hammer. I do feel that literally every one of these still remains a good unit even after these points changes though. The HQ section was just super outstanding before in the Codex. Uthar is now the only one who can lock in crazy auto splash damage with the Land Fortress's Railgun. The Ironhair Champion is still very fighty. The Car hands out those excellent Judgement Tokens. The Grimnir farms command points and makes a unit a lot tougher, and the Iron Master is still just ridiculously strong support for the Land Fortresses, cancelling incoming damage, big repairs, and making them hit better. Otherwise, getting for the non-HQ choices, Hearthkin Warriors went up to 12 points from 11, a small nerf there, and probably best seeing as they weren't one of the strongest units. I would say that perhaps the heaviest nerfs out of the book though fell on the Ironhair Hearthguard and the Chthonian Berserks, two units that I thought were both pretty usable, but maybe didn't deserve to be singled out and targeted by the heaviest nerfs in the whole book. Ironhair Hearthguard have gone up from 35 points to a whopping 45 points, a big plus 28% rise, and I honestly think that they're probably changed from a unit that was really quite strong into one that's really quite weak. I feel like 40 points would probably have been about right for them. They do have good shooting damage, particularly with those Vulcanite weapons and full rerolls to hit. They can spam out a whole bunch of mortal wounds, but for 45 points per model, literally just 2 wounds with the Void Armor isn't really all that great a defensive profile. I think they will be dying depressingly easily now. The single biggest relative points increase in the book came to the Chthonian Berserks. They've gone all the way up to 30 points from 22, a huge 36% points increase. And again, I do feel for these guys it might well just be a bit much. I think no one was debating that their damage output was truly excessive. Ridiculous power with those concussion mauls. There aren't all that many units in the game that could, say, slay an entire Imperial Knight for 110 points plus a command point and an equivalent of a chapter tactic. I think the issue with them is though that they're really quite slow and hard to deliver into combat. They only move 5 inches if they want to charge, and if they are ever caught out in the open, having basically no armor save does mean that they're quite easy to kill. Being both slow and fragile does mean that they need to have some pretty ridiculous damage when they get into combat, otherwise they're just not going to be worth it, and I feel that probably at 30 points they have turned into one of the weaker units in the Codex, and are probably not going to see much play. Otherwise, the Hernkin Pioneers, the Obsec bikes with the searchlights and things, they jump from 30 to 35. I still think that they'll be seen in decent numbers in lists, not anywhere near as much of a relative points increase, and fast moving objectives secured is generally a good thing. It'll certainly feel even more painful when you lose them though. The Sagittor's gone up to 130 base from 110. Again, potentially these can be okay gun turrets combined with Judgement Tokens and stacking a whole load of long range damage on enemies. 130 points really does make them feel pretty fragile though to return fire. They are arguably easier to kill than a standard Space Marine Rhino. The Brockir Thunderkin went up from 35 to 40, so a small points nerf there. I feel like if there was ever a unit in the Codex that they probably could have just left alone, I think it was them. Their gun stats weren't particularly overwhelming, and again they're really quite slow. I guess they perhaps didn't go up by quite as much as some other things, I guess. Finally, lastly, and one of the biggest nerfs comes to the Hecaton Land Fortress. That goes up to a cool 300 points from 230. I'm really not too surprised that that one went up by an awful lot. At 230 points it did seem just like the most easily efficient vehicle in all of Warhammer 40k. I feel like more in the high 200s or 300 was a bit more appropriate for it. Again though, absolutely far less standout, particularly as it isn't as easy to trigger that rail cannon effect, so it has suffered a bit of a double nerf with that massive gun unless you're running Uthar the Destined. So overall, these Votann changes have been a rather brutal readjustment in terms of Games Workshop's nerfs. Generally they tend to be at least a little bit more soft touch than this, and at least in my opinion, I don't think that these guys are going to be head and shoulders above the rest of the races in 40k anymore. I'd guess maybe might be somewhere in a bit more the high-mid sort of tier, rather than one of the very top factions in the game, unless there's any other updates or adjustments coming for the other top armies in the game in any current balanced data slates. They might well be struggling against some of the other top factions like Tyranids, Harlequins, or Necrons perhaps. The Votann certainly do have issues with speed, ranges, and movement and things, and even points for points they might not be all that great on the durability front and just have to rely on their massive damage output. In terms of units, the HQs still seem great, The troops in the Hernkin are alright. I feel like the Sagittor and the Land Fortress are still usable, but I must admit I feel like they've been a bit cruel to the Berserks, Thunderkin and Ironhair Hearthguard, all of which do seem like quite bad units for the points now. In any case, it's probably better that Votann are a bit more of a mid-tier faction rather than the strongest armies in the game. Hopefully this will mean that quite a lot more people are less reluctant to play against them, and there's less animosity towards them from the community. Let me know what you think of the changes down in the comments below. I'll be interested to hear what you guys make of the big Votann nerf, and whether or not you think Games Workshop's got it right or has gone too far. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming. I do tend to post new 40k videos just about every day, and I'll try and keep up with any Games Workshop rules changes or updates. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.